Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. For all of you UPSC aspirants out there, keeping up with international relations is like a must-do, right? And today we're diving into something that could pop up in both your prelims and mains exams. We're talking about Trump's latest move in the whole Ukraine situation.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. We're used to diplomacy moving at a snail's pace. But this time, Trump's like, forget the formalities, let's talk to Putin directly and try to hammer out a peace deal.
And that's exactly what we're breaking down today based on what the Indian Express and the BBC are reporting. And, Trump's relationship with Putin has always been a little complicated. Some might even say unpredictable. But this direct negotiation, it really throws a curveball into the whole situation, right?
No doubt about it. This is a total 180 from the previous U.S. administration's approach. They were all about working with their European allies, the whole multilateral thing. But this sudden shift, it sent shockwaves through the international community.
So we're seeing a major strategy change here. But what I'm really curious about is what's behind this sudden, change of heart.
Yep.
I mean, Trump went from praising Putin's tactics to being more critical of how Russia is handling the war. What's the end game here?
Well, you bring up the good point about Trump's changing stance on Russia. He's even gone as far as comparing these talks with Putin to the Yalta Conference. And, that's the one that basically redrew the map of Europe after World War II. And it's a pretty loaded comparison, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of Yalta, maybe you could give our listeners a quick recap of what went down there. It seems pretty relevant to what we're talking about today.
Sure. Think back in 1945 as World War II is winding down, the leaders of the U.S., the U.K., and the Soviet Union met at Yalta. Their goal was to decide the fate of post-war Europe, and they essentially divided the continent into spheres of influence, which had major and long-lasting consequences for the geopolitical landscape.
Okay, so bringing it back to Trump and Putin, they're saying they want peace, but is this the real deal? Or is it just a way for Putin to get a stronger foothold in Ukraine? Because Zelensky seems pretty determined to hold his ground, especially with all the support he's getting from the West.
That's the million-dollar question. And there's a lot of skepticism out there. Zelensky is understandably hesitant to give up Ukrainian territory, and many experts believe that Russia might be using these negotiations as a cover to regroup and solidify their control over eastern Ukraine.
So it's like a high-stakes poker game with everyone trying to figure out who's bluffing and who's not. But there's another interesting piece of the puzzle here that I wanted to bring up. It seems like Europe is getting sidelined in all of this. Is this intentional on Trump's part, or is it just a side effect of his go-it-alone approach to foreign policy?
It's definitely raising some eyebrows. Europe's absence from these talks does seem to mirror what happened at Yalta, where the big powers made decisions that impacted the whole continent, often without much input from the countries involved. And on top of that, Trump has made some statements that suggest he's not as committed to European security as previous U.S. administrations.
He's even questioned Ukraine's hopes of joining NATO, hasn't he?
He has. And he's also said that trying to restore Ukraine's pre-2014 borders might not be realistic, and this raises serious concerns about the future of the transatlantic alliance. That close partnership between the U.S., Canada, and most of Europe. It's been the foundation of Western security for decades, but Trump's actions seem to be weakening it.
And this brings us to the question that's probably on everyone's mind, especially you UPSC aspirants out there. What does all of this mean for India?
Well, India is in a unique position, unlike in 1945, when India was on the verge of independence and not a major global player today. India is a rising power with a lot of international influence. Modi's upcoming meeting with Trump will be crucial to understanding how the U.S. plans to navigate this new and potentially unstable world order. Welcome back to our deep dive on Trump's diplomatic overture to Putin on the Ukrainian conflict.
It's amazing when you think about how different the world is now compared to back in 1945 when they had that first Yalta conference back then. India was about to become independent, not really a big player on the world stage, but
now India is a force to be reckoned with.
Exactly.
And that's why Modi's meeting with Trump is so important. It's a chance for India to, really make its presence felt and be clear about its interests and priorities in this new world order, which, let's face it, feels a bit shaky right now.
Okay, so let's imagine for a second that Trump actually pulls this off, against all odds, and his peace efforts actually work. How would that change the whole geopolitical landscape, especially in Asia? And what role could India play in this new reality?
Well, if a U.S.-Russia agreement on Ukraine does happen, it could free up both countries to focus their energy and resources on other geopolitical hotspots.
You mean like keeping China in check?
Exactly. A shift in focus towards Asia is definitely possible. The big question is, will Trump try to use this same direct negotiation approach to deal with other conflicts, maybe even involving Taiwan now That would be a real game changer.
Wow, just think about how that would shake up the balance of power in the region, and how would China react to such a bold move?
That's the big question everyone's trying to figure out right now. We know that Russia and China have been getting closer, presenting a united front against what they see as Western interference. But a successful U.S.-Russia deal could really disrupt that dynamic.
So we could be on the verge of a major realignment of global alliances. It's like watching a diplomatic earthquake unfold, with aftershocks rippling across the world.
It's definitely a possibility, and for India, navigating this ever-changing landscape will require some serious strategic thinking. On the one hand, closer U.S.-Russia ties could potentially ease tensions in Europe, creating more room for cooperation on things like counterterrorism.
But on the other
On
hand,
the other hand, it could also put more pressure on India to take a stronger stance against China. Remember, the U.S. sees India as a key partner in its Indo-Pacific strategy, which is basically all about countering Chinese influence in the region.
so India is walking a tightrope, trying to maintain its independence while also using its relationships with both the U.S. and Russia to its advantage. It's a delicate balancing act, to say the least.
No doubt about it. And this brings us to another important aspect of this whole situation. The economic dimension. Both India and the U.S. have expressed concerns about China's trade practices and its growing economic influence.
Right, we talked about that earlier. Could this shared concern lead to a new economic order? Maybe a group of democratic nations focused on fair and balanced trade?
It's not impossible. We've already seen some movement in that direction, with the U.S. promoting initiatives like the Blue Dot Network. It's essentially a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative aimed at promoting transparent and sustainable infrastructure development.
And with India also pushing for greater economic self-reliance and diversifying its supply chains.
Exactly. There's definitely potential for collaboration there. Modi's meeting with Trump could be the perfect opportunity to explore these ideas further and see if there's common ground for a more cooperative approach to economic development and trade, one that prioritizes transparency and sustainability.
So we've got potential geopolitical realignments, possible shifts in economic alliances, all stemming from this surprise diplomatic move by Trump. It's a lot to process, to be honest. As UPSC aspirants getting ready for those exams, how should we be analyzing these events? What are the key takeaways?
Well, first of all, this situation really highlights the importance of understanding history and how it influences current events. We've seen how Trump's actions echo past diplomatic moves like the Yalta Conference. Knowing your history helps you spot patterns, make connections, and see parallels, which is crucial for doing well in both the prelims and mains exams.
That makes sense. Anything else?
Secondly, this whole situation shows how dynamic and ever-changing international relations really are. Alliances shift, power dynamics evolve, and individual leaders like Trump, in this case, can have a huge impact on how things unfold. You need to be able to analyze these changes, understand their implications, and see how they might affect India's foreign policy.
So basically, don't just memorize facts and figures, dig deeper. Understand the underlying forces shaping the world and think critically.
Exactly. And finally, always remember that diplomacy is a complex process. There are always multiple perspectives to consider, and the outcome of any negotiation is rarely straightforward or predictable. Hone your critical thinking skills. Learn to analyze different viewpoints, challenge assumptions, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
That's great advice, and not just for aspiring diplomats or policymakers. It's relevant for anyone trying to understand this complex world. We've covered a lot of ground: the potential for peace in Ukraine, the reshaping of global alliances, and what it all means for India's strategic and economic interests. But before we move on, I want to get your perspective on something that often gets overlooked in these big geopolitical discussions: the human element. What does all of this mean for the average Indian citizen? How might their lives be affected by these global shifts?
That's an important question. It's easy to get lost in the abstract discussions of geopolitical influence and economic order, but the reality is that these global shifts can have very real consequences for people's daily lives.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Of course, for instance, if there's a major shift in global trade patterns, as we've been talking about, it could directly impact the prices of goods in India. It could also affect job opportunities, depending on which sectors benefit or suffer from these changes.
So it's not just about abstract concepts like geopolitical influence or economic order. It's about real people and how their lives are shaped by these global events.
Precisely. And I think that's something that's crucial for UPSC aspirants to remember as they analyze these complex issues. It's not just about passing an exam, it's about understanding the world we live in and the forces that shape our lives and the lives of others.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've been talking about former President Trump's surprising decision to directly engage with Putin on the Ukraine conflict. It's been a wild ride, right?
Definitely, from the shockwaves in Europe to the potential fallout in Asia, we've covered a lot.
And now, for all you UPSC aspirants out there, this is where it gets really important, how this whole global power play could impact India. This is straight from your main syllabus and could even show up in prelims, so pay attention.
Absolutely. Understanding how these global shifts create challenges and opportunities for India is key, not just for your exams, but for anyone who wants to understand the future of Indian foreign policy.
Okay, so let's say Trump pulls it off and we see a big realignment of global alliances. What's the best case scenario for India in this new world order? What opportunities could open up?
Well, in the best case, a more stable Europe, potentially without the threat of war, could open up new ways for India to strengthen its economic and diplomatic ties with European countries. We could see more trade, more investment flowing into India, and maybe even greater cooperation on global issues like climate change and technology.
So it's a chance for India to really step up on the global stage.
Exactly. And remember, a U.S. that's less focused on European security might be more likely to prioritize its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region, where India is a key player.
Makes sense. But let's be real. There are always two sides to the coin. What are the potential downsides for India? What challenges do we need to be ready for?
Well, as we discussed earlier, a closer U.S.-Russia relationship could put more pressure on India to side with the U.S., particularly when it comes to China. That could put India in a difficult position, potentially straining its relationships with either Russia or China. Nobody wants to be stuck in the middle of a geopolitical tug-of-war.
For sure, it sounds like India would need to be super strategic in its approach.
Absolutely. And beyond the geopolitical maneuvering, there's the economic side of things. To consider, any major changes in global trade alliances could have unpredictable consequences for India's economy. Diversifying its economic partnerships and making domestic manufacturing stronger will be crucial to handling any potential problems.
Being proactive, not reactive, good advice. This whole situation really highlights how complex and interconnected global politics are. It's like a giant chess game with all these players making moves, and the outcome is always uncertain.
It is, and that analogy emphasizes how important strategic thinking is, being able to anticipate different scenarios and plan accordingly for India. That means carefully assessing its own interests and priorities, figuring out the motivations of other major players, and developing a flexible foreign policy that can navigate these complicated dynamics.
So basically, India needs to be a master strategist, a top-notch diplomat, and an economic powerhouse all at the same time.
You could say that, but don't worry. I have faith in India's future diplomats and policymakers. They're a smart group, and that's where resources like the Deep Dive come in. We're here to help you, our listeners, develop the knowledge and insights you need to not just understand these complex events, but to really analyze them and form your own informed opinions.
Exactly. We've shared the main points from the Indian Express and the BBC, but now it's your turn. Dig deeper, explore different viewpoints, and come to your own conclusions. Remember, the UPSC exams aren't just about memorizing facts. They're about showing your critical thinking and analytical skills, so get those brains working.
And don't forget to engage with us, share your thoughts in the comments, let us know what other questions you have, and hit that subscribe button for more deep dives on topics that matter for UPSC aspirants.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, keep those perspectives expanding, and keep diving deep. This is The Deep Dive signing off.